Wisconsin cranberry growers are looking to harvest a crop of nearly 5 million barrels of cranberries. And that, of course, means that now you've got about 250 cranberry farms in Wisconsin producing more than 60% of the nation's supply. And Hans, I remember, I mean, we're going back 25, 30 years now, but I remember when every year it was kind of a race with Massachusetts as far as which state was going to be producing more cranberries than the other. And clearly at some point, Wisconsin producers said, hold my cranberry juice. And suddenly it was bogorama here. I don't know what else explains the big increase in production.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's a crop that we don't produce here on our farm, but boy, we're sure glad that the cranberry producers exist. They bring a lot of value to the state's economy. It's just another wonderful thing that Wisconsin produces a hell of a lot of.
You see its use highlighted more. We talked about how on Top Chef Wisconsin, one of the challenges was to make a dish with cranberries, not your traditional Thanksgiving meal. But yeah, Wisconsin's out here at 5 million barrels. Massachusetts, they said they're having a good year, but they're going to produce about 2 million barrels. Number three is New Jersey at 500,000 barrels, and Oregon about the same. They're all saying it's going to be a good crop. And again, any time we have a crop that is doing well, it's going to go well for farmers, provided there's a market for them. And I guess that's always the big question, whether it's dairy, cranberries, cash crops, and otherwise. It's one thing to talk about the growing conditions and the harvest, but now you got to have a place to sell them.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that takes all the infrastructure. You mentioned rail earlier, and that's just another piece of the puzzle. Everybody has to do their thing and get along and make. And I think it comes down to everybody being able to get a little something out of the system. It has to be multi-sided from that standpoint.
Yeah. By the way, in terms of the economic impact of the tiny little cranberry in Wisconsin, the executive director of the Wisconsin State Cranberry Growers Association told the Wisconsin State Farmer newspaper that cranberry production generates $1 billion in state economic impact and provides thousands of local jobs across Wisconsin. Obviously, we've done the same talking about dairy and other things, and one of the whole points of our biweekly visits here is to help people better appreciate the tremendous economic impact of farming across Wisconsin. But it does get us to that notion of the infrastructure. And I thought last week when we set this up, I feared, Hans, that we were going to be talking about a railroad strike in Canada that would have been crippling, not just to farmers in Wisconsin, but to manufacturers and consumers all around. It's kind of like the way we dodged a bullet. What was it, about a year ago with a potential railroad strike in the U.S. There's just so many components that make up the path from the farm to the table.
Absolutely, and the rail infrastructure is something that, again, public policy has a place to play. I've heard very, very conservative people say that we should nationalize the railroad, and I think that might have some. That might be something worth considering. I don't see how that could ever happen, but without that infrastructure that we rely on, and that we could rely on more if the infrastructure was better kept and less monopolized, it becomes again an avenue for whether it's raw materials or farm produce and crops and things to move where it needs to move efficiently and effectively. But that means everybody has to do well, right? The people who run those things and the people who work for them all have to be able to make a decent living.
Absolutely. And I was looking at the notes about the Canadian one. Well, I should back up a step. In the U.S., it was President Biden who stepped in and basically, imposed a deal but allowed negotiations to continue. And in the interim, since that happened, railroad workers and their unions have continued to push for paid vacation time and paid sick days. The paid sick days was the really big sticking point. And I'm happy to report it took months more of negotiating, but by and large, the unions that were threatening to strike have since won paid sick days as part of the ongoing agreement to operate the rail lines. There are similar issues going on with Canada, where again the government has appointed an arbitrator who ended a lockout last week after only about 16 hours. But as a result, those negotiations can now continue with both Canadian National and Canadian Pacific. But Hans, it just seems odd to me, and I know farmers don't get paid sick days. I understand that. But when I'm looking at other industries like railroads, it still baffles me that in the year 2024 we're still having fights about paid sick days and what railroad workers or workers anywhere have to do to keep their job and under terrible circumstances, either through their illness or taking care of a family member.
Yeah. Well, again, Pat, it just comes down to the notion that we need to make sure that everybody has a dignified situation as much as possible. That should be our goal, and making sure that people are taken care of, and especially if they work hard, they should be treated well. And when you look at again, it's a corporate profit kind of mentality that we measure our success in our economy by looking at what corporate profits were, rather than sometimes focusing on what people closer to the ground are getting out of their work in terms of financially and socially and so forth. Those are the things that we should measure versus just that almighty corporate dollar at the top.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. It's about so much more than shareholder price, for example. In this instance, we're talking about the railroad workers, but we could just as easily be talking about our ports. Recall, was it last year or the year before where levels on the Mississippi were so low that barges weren't able to necessarily either come to get crops or take crops to the marketplace. You've got the infrastructure work that Tammy Baldwin and others have been securing funding for at the Port of Milwaukee and Green Bay and Duluth Superior and more. And thankfully, we haven't really had truck drivers in the news recently. I recall in years gone by, there were talk of trucker strikes and things like that. It really just goes to show how interconnected all of this is, and why we need this broader view of the value of farming and everything around it to our everyday life in Wisconsin.
Absolutely. And I think unfortunately, the knee jerk sometimes for farmers or small business people is to sort of grumble and say, well, I don't get a paid sick day, or, that type of attitude. But we shouldn't be in the business of pulling one another down. We should be in the business of lifting one another up. And I think when you've got, whether it's rail workers or truck drivers or what have you, able to, have that sick day, able to be home with a sick child, those types of things, that lifts everybody's boat. That lifts everyone up. So that's what we should be focused on, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Or as Tony posted on YouTube just now, it sounds like some kind of global supply chain or something. And yes, it does. We're all very reliant on that, and then it's a matter of how you deal with it. Hans Breitenmoser, it's always great to talk to you. Thank you so much. Good luck with all the cleanup, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks a lot, Pat. Take care.